Today on Inside Utah Politics, the race for U.S. Senate. The stage now set for the general election. Senator Mike Lee here to discuss the strategy heading into November and where he stands on some of the key issues of the race. And the Department of Justice reaching an agreement with Facebook for unfair advertising based on race, what the tech giant agreed to do to address the issue.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Glenn Mills. It is time to go inside Utah politics. We do begin this morning with Utah Senator Mike Lee here to discuss his quest for a third term. Senator Lee, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Let's start off with your message to primary voters. As of recording, you were sitting at 62% of the primary vote. What is your message to them?
My message to them is that thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the nomination. Utah Republicans made a choice, and they made a choice against the inflation due to the runaway spending from the Biden administration. They made a choice in favor of protecting unborn human life. And they made a choice that we want to make sure that we continue to have a Republican representing Utah in the Senate.
38% of the vote went to your two opponents in the primary. They're going to be very important for you in the November election. So how do you reach out to them and make sure you get their vote in November?
Yeah, I'd love to have their support and indicated as much to both of them. And I appreciate both of them. The fact that they were willing to step forward and run campaigns, throw themselves into the ring. That's something to be commended. They're both energetic, hardworking, intelligent women who ran a great race.
So you've been busy with them during the primary election. You now turn your sights to Evan McMullin, an independent in the general election. How will your strategy change now that you move to this next stage?
My messaging doesn't change because my legislative strategy, it remains the same. But what I offer really is a contrast. It's a distinction. It's a contrasting message to that offered by Evan McMullin. Evan McMullin is now the candidate of the Democratic Party. He voted for, he supported, he campaigned for President Biden. He has continued to support President Biden's policies, even as they've been imposing this stranglehold grip on Utah's economy, with the average Utah family spending $800 a month every month just on their basic household expenses. Those are things that people of Utah don't want, and that contrast will be reflected in our respective campaigns.
A lot of political insiders I talk to are looking at the Trump factor as one issue of this race that could potentially play a role. Specifically, the attitudes of voters toward the former president. He endorsed you in this race. Is that something you welcome?
Sure it is. And other endorsements will follow. Some people who I agree with a lot, others coming from people who I don't agree with as often. I'm grateful for all endorsements that I get in this race. Look, what the people of Utah are focused on right now is the fact that it's very, very difficult just to get by. I mean, far and away the biggest issue relates to inflation. And this is inflation that is the predictable, foreseeable, and in fact foreseen and warned of consequence of the flagrant, excessive deficit spending that President Biden pushed during his first months in office.
Do you think an endorsement from the former president has any impact on this election at all?
I think it might have had some impact on the primary, less so in the general. I think people were focused on where their government is now rather than where their government was 2 years ago.
Back in 2020, you were on a campaign stump with the former president, and you referred to him or likened him to Captain Moroni. Would you stick with that today, or was that a mistake?
No, look, that was a passing comment that I made a couple of years ago, and I understand why my political opponents would love to continue focusing on a passing comment I made a couple of years ago, something that I've acknowledged, probably not my greatest moment or the best word choice. I know what I meant when I said that, and I've explained that at great length. But what people in Utah are focused on is their ability to just get by. Right now, we've got a whole lot of people who can't even feed their kids. They can't feed their babies because they can't find formula. Even if they can afford it, they can't find it because there's a 90% shortfall rate in formula. That's why I passed successfully in the Senate last week a bill called the Formula Act that, once passed by the House of Representatives, is going to provide real meaningful reform. But there are all kinds of other areas where people still can't access the things that they need because they can't afford them, because they've been rendered unaffordable. Those are the things that are going to drive this election.
The January 6th hearings, they've been going on publicly for a couple of weeks now. You have come out and said you would be willing to testify. What would your message be to them when they pushed you about the logic behind you looking into the alternate elector theory? What would you tell them?
Well, first of all, let's remember how all of this culminated. All of this culminated in me voting to ratify the results of the 2020 presidential election. So I knew approaching January 6th, I knew what a disaster Joe Biden would be, and I knew that Joe Biden was about to become our next president. And so if there had been a shift in this, had the election turned out differently, that would have been better. So moving up to that moment, of course, I dotted the I's and I crossed the T's. When I heard rumors that there were some states that were going to be replacing their electoral votes, I wanted to find out if those rumors were true. I followed up on them, not trying to persuade anyone, simply trying to figure out whether there was any truth to the rumors. The rumors were false. On that basis, I voted to certify the election.
If the rumors were true and some states were looking into that, do you believe that would have been constitutional, and what could have happened in the event that that did take place?
Okay, so if a state withdraws its slate of electoral votes, and if it does so based on a conclusion that that is the accurate result of the actual election that they had, yeah, that has significant constitutional implications to it, and it might well have resulted in a change. But that's a very unusual thing to have happen, and that's why I investigated quickly as soon as I heard what those rumors were, because I wanted to rule that out if that weren't the case.
Did you think about the potential chaos of
course.
What would take place
Look,
in that event?
Anytime you have a state, after the electors have convened and cast their votes, that's an extraordinary, exceptional thing. So of course I thought that through. It's one of the reasons why I was making these calls. I thought, this is going to be chaos. We need to understand what's happening, if anything. So as much as anything, it was my job to rule that out. And eventually I was able to rule it out.
Did it bother you at all? It did some people, I know, so I'd like your thoughts on this. Did it bother you at all that as early as August before the election, the president started laying the foundation for this potential narrative in the event that he did lose? Did that trouble you?
Yeah, I didn't like that. I didn't like it for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's always better, if you're worried about the election procedures, it's 1,000 times better to deal with those up front through litigation prior to the election. Very difficult to unscramble the egg after the election has occurred. And number two, I think that emphasized something that wasn't helpful to the president, to emphasize weakness going into a presidential election. That's not a great thing.
Let's move to Roe v. Wade. You've been very supportive of the decision handed down by the Supreme Court. I'd like your thoughts on this, though. What we have essentially is this patchwork of law now throughout the country, where it's illegal right now after 18 weeks in the state of Utah. That other trigger law is working its way through the courts. But right across the border in Colorado or Nevada, it's still legal. Women still have access. So the idea of it putting an end to abortion, is that really going to happen when those who have the means anyway are able to just cross state lines to have access?
Yeah, so if you're asking the question from a standpoint of constitutional policy, it shouldn't change anything. Look, there are all sorts of things that are legal in Nevada that are not legal in Utah. And there are all sorts of things that are decided by state law that are different from one state to the other. So the question isn't really whether you're going to have a different outcome in some states than in others. That's the norm in our system. The question is whether there's anything in the Constitution that makes it distinctively federal and takes away from the people's elected lawmakers at the state level the discretion to make that decision as lawmakers. There isn't. And so state legislatures will be primarily the decision makers with regard to abortion policy.
One last question on that. President Biden coming out on Thursday saying he would like Congress to move forward with codifying Roe v. Wade. And he even suggested a one-time workaround of the filibuster. Your thoughts on that?
First of all, he's not just talking about codifying Roe versus Wade. The legislation that President Biden and the Senate Democrats, all of them, are pushing is a very aggressive move that makes Roe versus Wade look mild by comparison. This would extend an almost unmitigated, unbroken right to abort a baby, a fully developed baby, up until the moment the baby takes its first breath outside the womb. That's stunning. And look, there are only 12 or 13% of all Americans who share that radical view. And that is the view taken by President Biden, by Chuck Schumer, and Senate Democrats.
All right, I will note that as of right now, they don't have the votes to do that, the workaround with the filibuster. So we'll see how that plays out, and we will continue to follow this campaign as well, Senator. Appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You bet. Still to come, there were a lot of other races on the primary ballot that Utahns were weighing in on as well. Our panel is going to break down the results and look ahead to the Lee-McMullen matchup a little bit later. But first, President Biden, as we just discussed, vowing to act following the reversal of Roe v. Wade. What he plans to do in a reaction from those who say his power is limited in this situation after the break. The Department of Justice and Meta, formerly known as Facebook, have reached a settlement to reverse the platform's discriminatory advertising practices in the housing sector. Washington correspondent Raquel Martin with that story.
Meta, formerly known as Facebook, is promising to make sweeping changes to its advertising algorithm to prevent housing discrimination. As a part of a settlement with the Department of Justice, Meta says it's building a new system to, quote, ensure the age, gender, and estimated race of a housing ad's overall audience matches the age, gender, and estimated race of the population eligible to see that ad. The settlement comes after the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development accused the platform of violating the Fair Housing Act by targeting ads to some users while excluding others. Now, Meta has until December to make necessary changes to avoid further action by the Department of Justice. But here on Capitol Hill, some lawmakers say they're unsure Meta can be trusted to live up to its promises.
We're going to have to stay on top of this.
Missouri Democratic Congressman Emanuel Cleaver heads the Financial Services Subcommittee on Housing. He previously wrote to Facebook complaining about their unfair housing ads.
And I said to Mr. Zuckerberg, you're going to have to give some personal attention to this.
Cleaver believes the platform needs permanent oversight to ensure new discriminatory practices don't reappear.
If we take our eyes off this new Meta platform, there's no telling what could happen.
In Washington, Raquel Martin.
Cleaver says he would like to bring Zuckerberg back to Capitol Hill to testify about this and a long list of issues concerning their algorithms. He says regulations are far overdue. Federal government officials say they're launching a new action plan to help those who are trying to access abortions that live in states where it's now illegal. But as Washington correspondent Alexander Lamone reports, the issue isn't so simple.
Friday's Supreme Court decision was despicable.
Secretary of Health and Human Services Javier Becerra says the federal government is working to ensure patients in all states have equal reproductive health care.
Every option is on the table.
Secretary Becerra says HHS is considering paying for travel vouchers for patients to access abortions, and he's aware of the idea of building abortion clinics on federal land in conservative states. Becerra says any federal action could take time because the issue is legally complex, but he says federal law requires federal health care programs to cover family planning, including abortion in some cases.
We will make sure that if a state is utilizing federal funds under federal programs, healthcare programs, that they respect the laws.
Becerra said his department is working with the Justice Department
to ensure that states may not ban medication abortion based on a disagreement with the FDA's expert judgment.
But a major legal fight is expected in the country over access to abortion medication.
There is no magic bullet, but if there is something we can do, we will find it.
Federal action must comply with the law, which now includes the Supreme Court decision and the Hyde Amendment, which prohibits the use of federal tax dollars for abortion, except in cases of rape, incest, or to protect a woman's life. In Washington, Alexandra Limon.
Coming up, the dust is settling from the primary election. Our panel weighs in after the break.
watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now to break down some of the big stories of the week with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have former Utah GOP Chair Derek Brown and former Salt Lake City Councilman Charlie Luke. Gentlemen, great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to be here. Thanks.
All right, let's break down these primary election results. So many storylines developing. What's one of your top? Derek, let's start with you.
Well, I think one of the things we heard going into this is that Utah would sort of lurch to the right and that you'd see a lot of the incumbents that were challenged from the political right. Where there were accusations that the incumbents weren't conservative enough. And you would think that with the low turnout we had, that would favor those challengers. But one of the interesting takeaways I found is that that simply didn't happen. I mean, virtually every incumbent, with one or two minor exceptions, every major incumbent at the state and federal level survived last night. And I think the takeaway from that is that Utahns, by and large, are saying, the direction that we're going as a state is the direction that we want to go. And so, I mean, there were a lot of good efforts by those challengers, but very few of them paid off.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen an election where it appeared that challenges were so emboldened to take on incumbents. But as you point out, by and large, it was a very good night for incumbents. Charlie, what's that?
Yeah, I noticed the same thing. I mean, there were a couple of high-profile incumbents who did lose. Gene Davis in Salt Lake was one of them. But by and large, it was really interesting to see how different the primary was from the convention. At the convention, there was a lot of, both the Republican convention and Democratic conventions, there was a lot of discussion about whether, the party was going to be moving too far to the right, too far to the left. And last night did a fairly good job of, I think, moderating a lot of those decisions.
Okay, let's focus on the Senate race. That was the big ticket item of the night on the Republican ballot. We now have a matchup set for November between Senator Mike Lee going for his third term and independent candidate Evan McMullin. Derek, what are the early storylines from this race?
Well, I think this will be probably the marquee race of the fall. We'll see a lot of money that goes into this race. I mean, I think Senator Lee in the end pulls it out because up until now, McMullin has had sort of a free pass when it comes to issues. I mean, no one's really asked him, where are you now on Roe v. Wade? I mean, he was in favor of overturning it, and then he kind of backpedaled, and no one really has pushed him on issues like that. So I think he's gotten kind of a free pass, and once the free pass ends and people start asking him the hard questions, honestly, I think whatever he's showing in the polls is going to go down, and so I would predict Senator Lee wins fairly handily when push comes to shove.
Charlie, before I get to you, I want to follow up on one thing with Derek real fast.
Yep.
He has been, Senator Lee, fending off two primary candidates. So how do you expect the strategy of the campaign to change now that he is focusing on just one candidate?
I don't think you're going to see much of a change because ultimately I don't think that the campaign has been running with them in mind. I think for the most part everyone has always assumed that he would fare very well in the primary last night, and I think that the reality is he did perform exactly as sort of the polling indicated he would, and so I don't know that you'll see much of a shift, only because the reality is I think they've been running against McMullin all along.
Okay, Charlie, your thoughts on this race?
Yeah, I think that, I don't want to call it a marquee race because I think last night was the decider. Mike Lee really had to get the nomination, and he did that. I have to agree with everything that Derek was just talking about with Evan McMullin. I mean, you have to run for something. You can't just run against something. And the only thing we've seen Evan do is run against Trump and now running against Lee. For me, one of the things, when he said that he was not going to caucus with either the Republicans or the Democrats, at that point, what is the purpose? We can't send somebody back who is just going to be completely ineffective, and that's the concern. And so I think for Mike Lee, he would be foolish to do anything different. Last night worked. He was able to fend off two challengers and still ended up with over 60% of the vote. This is Mike Lee's race to lose.
But let's talk about this coalition for a minute, Charlie, if you will, of Democrats, foregoing their own candidate at convention and instead deciding to endorse Evan McMullin.
Yeah.
Potentially, he's obviously going to be trying to go for unaffiliated voters, and he's also going to have his eye on that 40% that didn't vote for Senator Lee in the primary. you're a Democrat.
Yep.
Are you willing to vote for Evan McMullin in this race?
I didn't support Evan in his attempt because I think Derek's right. There is so much about him that we just don't know, and so I'm not willing to stand behind a candidate who has never been involved, in the state issues, who has not run for office, who has not spent a lot of time in Utah. I mean, I respect Evan for what he's done in his career. I would certainly love to see somebody else take over for Mike Lee. I just don't see it happening.
Derek, that 40% that didn't vote for Senator Lee, well, 38 to 40%, it's going to be changing. Is he going to be able to easily win them over?
Yeah, I think not easily, but I think he will when push comes to shove, because, I mean, as Charlie was just mentioning, I mean, the reality is, I mean, not that I've been, the sort of the standard of like political involvement in Utah, but I've been, I've been the Republican Party chair for a number of years, been in the House. I've only seen Evan McMullin once in my life, and it was actually in this studio after you interviewed him. I mean, literally, Glenn, that's the only time I've ever even seen the guy. And so, as Charlie said, he's only stood for two things. I don't like Donald Trump, and that was 2016, and now it's I don't like Mike Lee. And so no one really knows much about him, and he hasn't really been a fixture of presence here in Utah. So I think the reality is McMullin has hit his high water mark, and I don't see him going anywhere but down from here.
Okay, I do want to point out he will be on the show next week, and we'll be asking him some of those very questions you talk about on issues and where he stands.
Great.
I want to move on to the state legislature. Charlie, let's start with you there. Some fascinating races in the Senate. Derek Kitchen really in a heated, contested race with Jen Plum, and then longtime Senator Gene Davis is going to lose his seat to newcomer Nate Bluen. What do you make of those races there on the Democratic side?
I think that, with Senator Davis, he has been in for so long, and I think that there have been, for years, questions about whether or not, he was still the right person for that seat. Nate came in and ran a really good, hard grassroots campaign. So it's going to be interesting to see, how he does and how he's able to lead in the Senate. With Derek Kitchen and Jen Plum, this is fascinating because it's essentially a rematch from 4 years ago, where Derek ended up winning by about 500 votes. He's ahead now by about 150, I think the last I checked. So that one is still very close, but we'll have to see. But for me, the most interesting story of the night, I think, in the legislature were all of the incumbents who are returning, who really, there was a scare, especially in Davis County and some of the other counties along the Wasatch Front. There were a lot of more moderate incumbents who were challenged in the convention who ended up winning re-election last night. Ray Ward in Davis County is one who it's going to be great to see him back up there.
Senator Stevens, we were watching closely, Senator Milner as well. Derek, on the county level, we saw some interesting developments with incumbents that it didn't go so well for them.
Exactly. I mean, at the federal and state level, pretty much the status quo remains, but at the county level, I mean, we saw Bill Lee, who's a long-term county council or county commissioner in Utah County that lost. We had someone here in Salt Lake County. Then interestingly, something few people are probably aware of, but in a lot of the rural counties, there were some fixtures that are no longer county commissioners. In Millard County, both of the incumbents lost. In Beaver County, Commissioner Whitney, Uinta County, I mean, there were 5 or 6 of those rural counties where it seems like, while the voters may have been okay with where the county was going from a federal and state standpoint, not so at the county level.
Yeah, some interesting dynamics there. Charlie, we have about 30 seconds left. We need to make this quick. Also, the Senate race between Representative Stephanie Pitcher and Deandre Brown. Big endorsements coming in for Brown, but Pitcher running away with more than 70% of the vote.
To me, that was surprising. Not that Stephanie won, but just the number of people lined up against her. And then to still win as big as she did was remarkable and truly a testament to her campaigning and walking the neighborhood.
Okay, gentlemen, boy, great insight and conversation. We could go on for a lot longer, but unfortunately we've run out of time. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break. We leave you now with a look at what's on the radar in the world of politics. Utah counties will have 2 weeks to certify their primary election results. Board of Canvassers meetings will take place on Tuesday, July 12th. Candidates, successful ones, are now turning their attention to the general election, which is set for Tuesday, November 8th. Make sure to connect with me. I'd like to know what you think of this show and other issues that are important to you. You can email me at InsideUtahPolitics@abc4.com. You can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thanks so much for making us part of your Sunday morning. Hope to see you again next week as we go inside Utah politics.